Last week, our sermon was predicated upon Peter's great confession that happened at Caesarea Philippi. The verses that Sean just read for you are Mark's account of the Transfiguration. Not much time has gone by, and not much distance has been covered from the events that we looked at last week. Probably about a week after the great confession of Peter, we find the Transfiguration. The Bible simply tells us that this occurred on a high mountain. It doesn't give us the name of the mountain. Biblical scholars generally agree, and I think it makes sense, that this is referring to Mount Hermon, which is the highest mountain in the region. It actually stays snow-capped year-round. The Israeli ski team practices on Mount Hermon today, pretty much because it's the only mountain with snow in Israel. Mount Hermon is right in the very corner of disputed territory. It's on the sort of the corner between Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. It's an extreme northeast section of what we might generally refer to as Greater Israel. And it is almost 10,000 feet high. That certainly meets the criteria of a high mountain that's referenced in the book of Mark. Transfiguration is a word that some people may not understand completely. The word translated transfiguration in English comes from the Greek word metamorpho. And if that word sounds a little familiar, it's because that's the Greek word from which we get our English word metamorphosis. If you think back to elementary school science, you know that a metamorphosis is when a life form changes into something different. Probably the best example is that of a butterfly. Butterflies don't come out of eggs. Larvae come out of eggs, little worm-looking creatures. And as this larva matures, the time comes when it will spin a cocoon. And it will surround them. You've probably seen these in your bushes. You've seen them in trees sometimes, where it's like almost a little tiny little beehive, you might think of it that way. And in the exact right moment in time ordained by God, out of that cocoon will emerge not the larva that went in, but a beautiful butterfly. Metamorphosis is a change. It's a change in a living being. And that's exactly what transfiguration was. Jesus was changed during the transfiguration. Changed physically. Changed from the ordinary looking man who perhaps didn't look all that much different than any other person with which these three disciples would spend time on any given day, into just a glimpse of what the true godly Jesus really is. In our entire life, we've heard people talk about mountaintop experiences. A mountaintop experience is something that's really good. You're having a great time. And it's not always associated with church-related matters. It could be a concert that you went to that was just really inspiring. It could be an athletic team that's just won a big championship. It could be gaining something that you want to gain in life, maybe a promotion at work, maybe having someone that you love say yes when it comes to marriage. We can have lots of mountaintop experiences, but no mountaintop experience ever is going to equate to seeing the real Jesus, to see Jesus as he really is. And Peter and James and John had that experience. The Bible tells us that his garments became so radiant, they were white and bright, like no launderer person could accomplish on the face of the earth. You have to go to the book of Matthew, the parallel account of the Transfiguration in chapter 17, where we're told that Jesus' face shone like the sun. I'll give you kind of a big word. We refer to this as the Shekinah glory of God. That is the exact same situation that we see in the Old Testament, when God's glory led the children of Israel on the exodus from Egypt. The pillar of fire by night, the pillar of cloud by day. The actual glory of God was visible in this limited way. And these disciples saw the real Jesus. That's a mountaintop experience. Not only did they see the real Jesus, but they heard the plans of God. All we're told in the book of Mark, the 4th verse, is they were talking with Jesus. And I'm talking about Moses and Elijah, who were there on the mountain with Jesus, with these 3 disciples. But if you go to the book of Luke, the 9th chapter, which again is a parallel portion of Scripture, where Luke is describing the Transfiguration, we see that the plans that were being discussed were for Jesus' crucifixion, for him going to Jerusalem, to dying for the sins of the world, to being raised from the dead. And he was talking about that with Moses and Elijah, and it didn't come as any surprise to them, because they had been in heaven with Jesus when these plans were finalized, if you want to use that word. I don't think it's adequate, but probably the best word I can come up with. And they were talking about what's going to happen. Peter and James and John not only saw Jesus as he really was, they heard the plans of God. They heard the very voice of God. Can you even imagine? We see that at the burning bush. We see that at the baptism of Jesus. And we see it right here in verse 7, where a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." I've had some really good times in my life. I've had some times that were just great experiences. I've had some times in worshiping Jesus when I just felt like I was on the top of the world. Maybe it was at a revival or to worship meetings, sometimes right here in this church, where you just say, wow, what a good worship service this was. It's just a mountaintop experience. Nothing compared with the mountaintop experience that Peter, James, and John experienced. But I've had some really good experiences in my life. But you know what happens? They don't always last. We go from the mountaintop to the valley. Now, the Word doesn't tell us that Peter, James, and John went down to the valley. But we know they did. You know how? Because if you come off the top of the mountain, there's really only one place you're going to go. And that's down and down into the valley. And they went in short order from the top of the mountain to the valley so low. How do we go from mountaintop experiences in our spiritual life to valleys, to dark times, to times where we're not walking as close to God as we should? It just happened. How did just a few days ago, just a few weeks ago, I felt as close to God as I've ever felt. And today it just seems sort of like I'm not as close as I was. at the risk of sounding trite, I can tell you God didn't move. God's right where he always was. So what happens to us to cause us to leave these great experiences, these close experiences with God, and sink down into a valley of despair? Well, the 9th chapter of Mark gives us some examples. They're not exclusive. There's probably a lot of things we could do to get off the mountaintop and into a valley. But one is the problem of self-reliance. If 3 disciples went to the top of the mountain with Jesus, 9 more were left in the valley. And they weren't just completely wasting their time. They were apparently spreading the word. They were doing things that Jesus would have wanted them to do. And one of the things they were doing is they were trying to cast the demon out of a demon-possessed child, but they just couldn't do it. What was the real problem? The problem was self-reliance. What the word says is they tried to cast it out, but they could not do it. Verse 18. They were trying to rely on their own power. They had seen Jesus work miracles. Jesus had given them the power to work miracles. And they just seemed to have been focused on what they were going to do rather than allowing the Spirit to work through them. And if you want to get into the valley of despair in your spiritual life, I'll give you a good way to do it. Start relying on yourself and stop relying on Jesus. In the same account, the same situation, this demon-possessed boy, we see another problem that'll take you to the valley of spiritual despair, and that is the valley of partial belief. These are some of my favorite verses in the book of Mark, and they're kind of laugh out loud funny. The father of the boy is so discouraged. The disciples have not been able to do anything for his son. His son is tormented by this demon that's really trying to kill him. And the father comes to Jesus and says, well, if you can do anything, I wish you would. And Jesus, you can hear sarcasm drifting out, coming out of his mouth. Listen, it says, if I can do anything. What do you mean, if I can do anything? And the father quickly realizes his mistake and quickly retreats and says, Lord, I believe. Help thou my unbelief. Too many of us have that same problem. We believe, but we don't believe fully. Now, belief is an exercise of intellect. It's something that you do in your mind. It's a cognitive action. We believe who Jesus is, but maybe we don't always see the real Jesus. If we have partial belief, that will get us into the valley of spiritual despair. We need to believe fully. And while I sort of joke a little bit about and I think the gospel writer meant it to be humorous, if I can, let's focus on what the Father then says immediately. Lord, I believe. Help thou my unbelief. We need to be praying that God will expand and deepen our belief, that will help us to believe more fully so that we believe in the Jesus who is God, and we don't artificially put limits on what he can do for us. The next problem that'll get you into the valley of spiritual despair is pretty similar to the problem of partial belief. And that's the problem of meager faith. If you look at Mark 9:29 and especially Matthew 17:20, the disciples asked Jesus a good question, a fair question. And Jesus doesn't mock them. He knows their heart. He knows that they truly want an answer, and so he answers the question. The question they ask is, what went wrong? Why couldn't we do it? We've seen you do it. You've given us power. We cast out demons previously. Why couldn't we do it here? And Jesus says, in a quote from Matthew 17:20, it is because of your meager faith. Well, what's the difference between partial belief and meager faith? They're similar. I'm slicing the onion a little thin here. I'll grant you that. But I think there is a distinction. Belief is something you do with your mind. Faith is something you do with your heart. Belief has to do with recognizing who Jesus really is. Faith is having confidence that Jesus will work through us. And too many times we have the problem of meager faith. We want to, just sort of like the disciples, we want to trust ourselves rather than trust Jesus. And if you want to be in a valley in your spiritual life, try trusting yourself rather than trusting Jesus. So, we see the problem of self-reliance. We see the problem of partial belief. We see the problem of meager faith that is taking these disciples off of the mountaintop and down into the valley. And those problems can affect us today just as surely as they affected the disciples 2,000 years ago. But it doesn't stop there. We get the rest of the story, so to speak, as we get to the end of the 9th chapter of the book of Mark. On the way down the mountain, as they've had the experience there with the demoniac child, and they're headed to Capernaum, the disciples are kind of hanging back and talking among themselves. And Jesus knows exactly what they're saying, but they don't know. They still don't understand. They think they're going to hide from Jesus. They're going to kind of, like we talked about last week, we think we're going to hide from Jesus. Well, we're not going to hide. Jesus knows our hearts. Jesus knows our actions. And he asked a question of his disciples, and it's not because he didn't know the answer. It's because he wanted to make them tell him the answer. What were y'all talking about on the road? And you can almost see their faces like, uh-oh, we're busted. It's like a little kid that gets caught, or even a pet, a little animal. My cat Molly loves to steal Stephanie's stuff. And Stephanie will be working on like shoebox projects or something. She'll have her yarn there by her chair, and she'll look the other way, and that cat will run in and grab it and run in out of the room. And you'll look at her, and she'll get this look on her face. She knows it. She knows she wasn't supposed to do it. Children, same way. They know good and well they weren't supposed to do it, but they did. And I can just see these disciples right now, that same look on their face. I don't want to tell you. What were you talking about? We were talking about who's the greatest among us. Mm-hmm. You want to get in the valley. I've given you some good suggestions here. If you want to get off the mountaintop, get in the valley. But if you want to take the express route to the valley, you don't want to wait in line. You want the interstate highway from the mountaintop to the valley. Start thinking about yourself rather than thinking about others. Start thinking about what a good person you are. Start thinking about how great you are. Think about how lucky God is to have you. And that'll take you to the valley of spiritual despair. Yes. Remember this. Whether you're on the mountaintop, whether you're in the deepest valley, or whether you're partway in between, Jesus is right there with you. Jesus is everywhere you may be. Hebrews, the 13th chapter, tells us that Jesus will never abandon us. I don't care how far away we are from where we ought to be. I don't care how low we've sunk. Jesus is there for us. Think of the fiery furnace, the 3rd chapter of the book of Daniel that's referenced in your sermon notes. I encourage you to go back and read it. I suspect most of us know it, but when I reread the 3rd chapter of Daniel this week, I saw things I'd never had seen before. I felt things I'd never felt before. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown into the fiery furnace that at Nebuchadnezzar's command had been heated to 7 times its normal heat. It was so hot that it killed the people who threw them in. You've had some bad jobs in your life, maybe. I'll tell you a bad job, being the guy throwing people in the 7 times hot furnace. And yet when they look in, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are there just fine. And they're not alone. Jesus is in that furnace with them. I do not care how bad a circumstance you're in. And I can't really think of a much lower valley than being thrown into a fiery furnace. That's somebody else may have some better ideas, but that's my number one candidate for having a really bad day, is being thrown in a fiery furnace. And yet Jesus is there with them, and no harm came to them because of Jesus' protection. In the 14th chapter of John, Jesus promises disciples, and this is just very shortly before his crucifixion, he's effectively saying, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, I don't want you to worry. I'm not going to be here with you, physically at least, like I have been. But the Holy Spirit, the Comforter, focus on that word, the Comforter, I will be with you. No matter where you are, Jesus is there with you, and Jesus is there for you. So what do? We're going to sing a hymn of invitation and dedication right now in just a second. Hymn number 320. Turn your eyes on Jesus. And that